So, and in fact, Medea is considered a national heroine in Georgia, the
Right.
state.
Yeah, it's
Well, I should say the
it's
country, not the U.S. state.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, yeah, it's like you were alluding to. There's this sort of curious superficiality to the Argonauticus, which people have always quite struggled with. I mean, it has a kind of almost a sort of ironical quality to it. I mean, like again, this lack of characterization, a lack of dramatic tension. I mean, the episodes with the gods are quite interesting because they have this sort of banal domestic style. You know, gods getting in squabbles about
And
things.
that's for me my favorite part of the Harryhausen film is the portrayal of Hera and Zeus, which is why I
Yeah.
bring Hera and Zeus as played by my doppelganger character and the
Mm.
character that's the actress there to give commentary. So you get different layers of commentary. You have the characters self-reflecting. I mean, in my in the very first of the plays, the characters are wondering, are there really gods? Heracles, and Theseus are openly, agnostic or worse. Jason, it seems that God worship is on the outs if we're to go by that first play.
Mm. I mean, there's also, I think, you know, you have a tendency to, as it were, attempt to inject realism into these myths. And it seems that from some of the academics that I've been reading, like that the Argonauticus itself was representative of a kind of move towards realism, maybe perhaps realism as they conceived it, which perhaps might read quite awkwardly to us now. But it's a strange sort of realism too. It's a conflicted sort of realism, and I suppose there's also sort of this conflict that plays out in other various works by you of a conflict between determinism and how shall we say, predestination. You know, free will and determinism. You know, like are we really in control of our fates? Are we puppets of the gods? Etc. etc. I mean, and you seem to, from our conversations, get into quite a lot of arguments with people about the nature of free will, and this seems to be represented by Jason sort of struggling with his the prophecy of his rise to heroism, but also his death.
Yeah. Well,
What?
let me give you an example. I recently, just 3 or 4 days ago, watched. I don't know if you ever heard of it. There's a YouTube channel called Cinema Cartography.
I've not heard of that, I'm
Okay.
afraid.
It's a British guy, and I think his Polish or Russian wife, Eastern European wife, and they're wannabe filmmakers, and they're very hit and miss. But they started a series on cinema from the earliest going, and they contrast the early films of Thomas Edison with the Lumiere brothers in France, and they talk about how Edison maximized films for their financial gain by having people basically do vaudeville acts. It was total fiction, whereas the Lumiere brothers were more popular in Europe because one of their very first films was workers leaving the Lumiere factory because they owned a factory that did regular photography, still photography, and
Yeah.
then they were getting into film. And it became a sensation. It's only like a 35, 40-second film from like 1896 or 7 or something like that with women and then men and then a dog and a few other things, a truck coming out of the factory, but it was real. And what it did was it broadened the sense of what was real, even though it was very pedestrian. And then one of their later films, a year or two later, they had the revolutionary idea of showing waves coming into Dover Cliff or something, and then they made a cut. They cut to the waves then going up a river or something, and so people were just astonished in the late 1890s by the realism as was seen. Now we look at that and we're like, okay, it's like watching a bug crawl across the sand. It's like, okay, but then it was revolutionary. And in the same way, when you're bringing up the Argonautica, compared to Iliad, compared to Aeneid, compared to the Odyssey, which is basically you could call it cultural dick waving. Uh, the Argonautica and the Civil War and other things from that era are seemingly more realistic because they don't necessarily go into. I mean, Jason is not. I mean, Jason is the hero of that poem, that work, but it's
he doesn't really do much
yeah,
in
and he's not the figure of Achilles. He's not the figure of Odysseus. He
no.
yeah. So
Yeah, he doesn't really do much. A lot of the except for kind of the say the even in sort of the later episodes, that's kind of more Medea's story, and
yeah.
the earlier ones we have, as you were saying, Heracles and Theseus and all these other characters.
But one of the reasons is the reader then, or the listener, if they were listening to this poem being read aloud, could probably identify more with Jason. Jason, not that he was an everyman because he was of royal birth and all, but Jason was a more everyman character than Odysseus, than Theseus. You know, Theseus, he killed the Minotaur with his bad hand. Heracles did all sorts of amazing feats. Odysseus, you know, goes on a 20-year voyage and comes back. You know, so Jason, in this sense, all he basically did was cross an ocean and steal you know, a national treasure, which,
Yeah.
relatively speaking, people then probably could relate to that a bit more than being, oh, Heracles, you know, Atlas, Heracles, can you uphold the sky while I take a whiz or something? You know, Heracles was a few notches above. You know, it would be the difference between comparing, say, Batman to whoever the supreme being is in the DC Comics universe. There's you know, you have Superman and the Martian Manhunter or whatever the other characters in between. So Jason was closer to that level that people could probably slip their shoes into, the way, you know, a Batman or maybe a Spider-Man might be.
It makes me think now. I really want to see a Dan Schneider does the Justice League, you know, or Dan Schneider does the Avengers. I mean, I wonder what that would look like. But yeah, I mean, it's there is a kind of strangeness, sort of an unresolvedness, perhaps an unresolvedness to the story that I think writers over the centuries have been attempting to work out for themselves. I mean, we've mentioned a few of these people, such as Jeffers, even Harryhausen, and Pasolini even did a Medea film. So I suppose, like, where did, you know, how did this remake take form in your mind? Like, where did you know that you should start?
Well, I mean, you basically start with Jason. Jason is the only character that appears in all 5 plays. Of the major characters, Jason's in all 5. Acastus and his father Peleus. Acastus is in the first 3. Acastus is the villain in the Golden Fleece tale, basically. Peleus, and what I did, I made Peleus the good king, and I made Jason and his father the bad kings. I switched that around because it makes more sense. Medea appears in at the end of play 2. She's in 3 and 4, and she appears as a silent ghost in 5. Heracles is in 1 and 2, and then he's a ghost in 5. Theseus is 1, 2, and 3, and then in 5 he's a ghost. So of the major characters, there's only Jason that's in all of them, and he's sometimes arguably not the main character. Even you know, there are interesting developments of other characters, but I started with the basic myth that he was taken away after Peleus took over. But instead of the old myth where Peleus usurps the good king Aeetes, it's Peleus who's taking over. He's the man of the people, a king of the people who's beloved, because Aeetes, not Aeetes, I'm sorry, Aeson or Aeson, is Jason's father, and he's the bad king. And so Jason comes back, and there's the idea of the man with one sandal, and this is how they know. Hera, I believe, tells Peleus that his reign will end when the man with one sandal comes. We see that at the beginning. Acastus befriends Jason, but he's working an angle, and Acastus is even working an angle against his father, which is a good thing that we don't have in the original, is that Acastus is sent onto the Argo to be Peleus's eyes and ears without Jason knowing it. He doesn't know the connection. But here, Acastus is working his own angles. He wants to basically usurp his father, we find out in later plays. So uh,
Yeah.
by doing these little tweaks to the characters and their relations and how they do that, I think you get a much more natural flow. Because throughout this play, you've got scheming dads. You've got Peleus, who's the best of them. You've got Aeetes, who's the father of Medea, and you got Aeson, who's the father of Jason. And
Mm.
they're all at some point trying to pull strings. Jason himself becomes a bad king and a bad father to his own children by the end. So
This is a theme you've kind of explored in other plays as well, sort of the lineage and sort of sons turning into their fathers, as it were, in the Khan plays. But as Hera's an interesting one too. I mean, even in the original myth, it's not often that we see Hera displayed as a kind of a virtue, as a good character. Often she's a really angry bitch, and
yeah.
but in this one she's the patron of the heroes. Although one could say that this is only because she has an animus. She wants to right a wrong that she feels has been done to her. But she appears in all the plays as well, I believe.
Yeah, okay. Jason, I should have said of the mortals. Hera and
Yeah.
Zeus appear in all the plays too, but sometimes they have whole scenes where they talk. In one, I think in the fourth play or maybe the last play, they only have a brief interaction. But
Yeah, she's still a quite interesting character, like Hera, as you've written her. I think a lot of the scenes between Hera and Jason are probably my favorite of the cycle, and I think the scenes between Hera and Zeus are interesting, but I think some of the most interesting philosophical conversations, as it were, play out between Jason and Hera, which have to do with I suppose all the things that we've been alluding to, the idea of predestination and heroism, and I suppose even the nature of myth. What the fuck is the point of myths and their retelling?
well,
Uh,
Jason starts in the first play. He's doubting everything because he knows he's been told, presumably off stage before the play begins. He knows that he's going to end up dying on the Argo when a piece of the mast, a rotted piece of wood, falls on him and kills him. So it's one of those things. Well, what should I? Okay, I'm going to become famous as an adventurer. I'm going to become a king. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. But at the end, I'm still going to die a very ignominious death. And he, in a sense, he's jealous to a certain degree of both Theseus, who later becomes an Argonaut, and in the Argonautica, I don't think Theseus is part, or Theseus is part of the Argo there, but I put him in because in other tales he is. It's just like with King Arthur, there are many different versions of whatnot. So I took the ones that are
yeah,
the best. So I put Theseus there because here then you have the three greatest heroes before the Trojan War. You have Theseus, Heracles, and Jason all on the same ship. And Jason basically becomes the captain because he doesn't get famous until afterwards, until he brings back the Golden Fleece. Basically he's in charge of the two. It's sort of like if this was a movie, you have some schlemiel as the main hero of the movie, and meanwhile you've got Brad Pitt and George Clooney as Theseus
yeah.
and Heracles,
It's the golden age of heroes, isn't it?
yeah.
That's an interesting thing too, like about the classical period. This whole idea of the golden age. I mean, it's a fairly recent thing that we have this idea of historical locomotion, as it were. That things are getting better, whereas in the classical world, it was this sense that all the great absolutely titanic heroic stuff had already come before, and that things actually might be getting worse.
Well,
Um, uh,
it's also a thing of cycles because in the Greek classical world, it's similar to the Norse myths in that the Greeks start out with nothingness. Then I think I forget which of the original powers of the universe are then they give birth to the Cyclops, to the Titans, to I think the Perseids
Titans
or
and
what,
such.
and so anyway, then the Titans displace. I think it's Gaia and maybe Chaos are the two
Yeah,
original.
yeah, yeah, I think
They
you're
are
right.
displaced by the Titans. The king of the Titans is it's Kronos. And
Kronos, yeah.
Uranos, well, which became the planet Uranus. Uranos is the guy who's the grandfather of everyone. Kronos is his son, which is the equivalent of Saturn. Saturn then gets the idea that his kids are going to usurp him, so he eats his first 6 kids, or first 5 or 6 kids, which includes Hera, and then Zeus is the 6th one. He's raised away, very much like Jason is, and then comes back and pulls his siblings out of it. He marries his sister Hera. He constantly cheats on her. Jason later, so in a sense, the whole Jason Medea thing is the mortal version of Zeus and Hera.